An interview with Curt McCasland done by Helen Ingram and Wendy, Gwynn, Laird Benner in summer of 2010.
All right, then we'll get started. What we've been wanting to do with each of our interviews is to first really get to understand why and how you became involved in the work that you're doing now. You're obviously been at Cabeza for a number of years. And we're actually thinking if you would reach back into your history and your past when conservation or environmental management or preservation or any of these issues became important to you. What was the motivation?
It'd probably be easier if I did this off the speakerphone. I guess for me, it's one of those things where I always knew what I was going to do. Mm-hmm. I grew up in the mountains of western Washington and spent most of my time out in the forests. And just quite honestly, I always knew that I was going to do this. It's kind of funny. I mean, I can actually think about the first time I actually came to Ajo, Arizona, and actually got, I think I was at the plaza and was sitting there. It was like spring break, and our friends were heading down to Mexico to do some diving. And I remember looking at my friend as I popped open a soda and told him that I would never live in a hellhole like this.
Dear.
Yeah, so, 10 years later, I'm still here. That answers your question.
So did you
I guess it doesn't, because I just described the place as a hellhole. Over time, I kept coming down into this area, and as I spent more and more time, began to appreciate it. And when this job came open, I actually was one of the few people that had actually been out on the refuge, and quite honestly, I think I was one of the few that actually been out there and actually knew about the place and actually wanted to work here.
Mm-hmm. Had you been working with the Fish and Wildlife Service prior to this?
Yes, actually, I had. I'd been working. I think I started off with the Forest Service for a couple of years, and then I'd been with the Fish and Wildlife Service for about 3 additional more.
Mm-hmm. Curt, what was it that made you want to work there? Can you just talk about any specific things?
At Cabeza.
Yeah.
I think what always intrigued me about the refuge was, especially back then, it was one of the few places in the lower 48 where you could really go and still get lost, where you wouldn't see any, you could get out into the middle of nowhere and you truly felt like you're in the middle of nowhere. Mm-hmm. No vehicles, no lights, nothing. I think that's what I liked. I think that was what would intrigue me the most about it initially.
And did you get a degree then prior to being in Forest? I mean, was there some sort of educational path that you went on knowing this is what you wanted to do?
Oh, yeah, most certainly. I mean, given the fact that I pretty much had been preparing for that since a very young age, so I knew what I was going to do. And, yeah, I went to, I got a bachelor's degree and then went off and got a master's degree.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Terrific. And you've been at Cabeza then for how many years?
I thought it was 10, but my wife corrected me, and this is our 10th summer.
Okay.
So I guess I added that in, but we've been here about 9.5 years.
Okay.
Curt, could you look at the physical resource of Cabeza and sort of tell us what's happened over those 10 years? What's your narrative of what has happened to the resource?
I think, you know what? Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
That's my question.
Okay. If I keep kind of stopping and going back and forth, occasionally I'll hear my voice and it kind of throws me off. So that's the one thing about this whole recording that seems kind of weird. So the one thing that's changed, or I guess the one thing that sticks out to me that has changed is just what I was talking about. The thing that intrigued me about being here was this was a place that you could go and you could really hide, where you would not see anybody, where it truly was a place where you felt like it was the middle of nowhere. That's changed dramatically. The desert, not only just the refuge, but this large tract of land that is bound by Yuma to the west and Highway 85 to the east, and the Highway 2 in Mexico and Highway 8 to the north, it's just gotten so much smaller over the last 10 years. In between all of the rescue beacons, all of the activity, both legal and illegal, there's just so many more people in this area, substantially more than what was here 10 years ago. And really kind of the very wild nature of it, from a very primitive standpoint, it's changed dramatically. I think it's still very wild. It just is now wild from more of an anthropomorphic standpoint.
Could you talk about the impact of this increased human activity on wildlife and the resources?
Yes, I can. It's some of it we haven't been able to quantify in terms of an exact number. I think part of the reason is that we've had to be very reactive, and some of these things we have not been able to study as much as we want because it's often associated with illegal activity. So we can't necessarily, we can't move our resources to try and measure those impacts when it's inherently bad. In other words, you don't want to be out there when someone is actually moving drugs through an area. Mm-hmm. That makes it somewhat difficult. But as an example, with Sonoran pronghorn, which is one of the species that the refuge is charged with, not only ensuring that they continue, that their existence continues into the future, but also we're tasked with trying to recover them and remove them from the Endangered Species Act. We've been working with them really for about 40 or 50 years, but more intensively within the last 20. And what we found was in 2002, which was one of our busier years here, we had a very long drought, almost a year-long drought, where we had less than an inch of rainfall. And the habitat conditions got to be really, really bad for pronghorn and for a lot of other wildlife. But where we lost about 90% of our pronghorn population, when we did our counts in November of 2002, we actually counted only 21 animals.
Ooh. And is that lost to Mexico because they migrated south, or lost like they're dead?
They were dead.
Uh-huh.
And most of them were falling over dead in the middle of the valleys. Mm-hmm. And we find them in some places we wouldn't expect them to be found. And the reason for that is that typically during the hotter, drier portions of the year, pronghorn tend to move up into we call the Arizona upland component of this desert, areas where it gets more rain on average. You know, the valleys tend to get less, the mountains and the Bajadas tend to get a little bit more. So they tend to move up into the hillsides a little bit and taking advantage of some of those more less xeric habitats where things are still green. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, the aliens were doing the same thing. They were moving their dope and smuggling folks through in these same places and taking advantage of, vegetation that still provided shade. Walking over rock was easier to avoid detection by Border Patrol versus walking out in the flats. So basically we had illegal activity occurring in the same places that pronghorn were trying to use. And to this day, in some of those areas, we still don't have pronghorn that have returned to those sites. So, short term, I can't say that, X percentage of pronghorn were affected by the movement of illegal folks or of folks moving into the United States or trying to smuggle drugs in. But I can tell you from a gut level feeling, I think it was significant. I just can't give you a number. Mm-hmm. And I think it still continues on to this day. And
they're obviously probably competing for water. I would imagine any kind of tanaha that was...
In some levels, that certainly is the case. I mean, that's from a wilderness standpoint. We do have that concern, and we deal with a lot of water type issues. And it certainly is. There can be competition for water, but I think that the bigger thing is probably just more of a disturbance factor, where pronghorn are being forced to run and to avoid areas, not only from the illegal activity, but unfortunately from the interdiction as well. I mean, if you have helicopters hovering over groups and things like that, or you have or you have vehicles traveling after folks, or illegal. You have smugglers moving dope through in vehicles, and Border Patrol chasing after them through these habitats. This is a desert, and you're asking newly born fawns and nursing does to basically move, run, do all kinds of other things that may affect their ability to provide to be able to nurse those fawns, or for those fawns as they're weaning, the ability for them to gain enough nutrients and moisture for them to stay alive.
Related to that, and understanding that you're not quoted and you're speaking only as an individual and not a federal official, could you just speak to any additional problems that may have been introduced by certain things? One, the border wall. Another, perhaps Arizona's recent legislation that is now a bit on hold, but has nonetheless affected the atmosphere.
I honestly don't think it's either one of those. I mean,
Okay.
you really, if I never get quoted, I'll be honest with you. The biggest thing here is it's the absurdity of it's the absurdity of this kind of cat and mouse game that exists on the border. But once you move away from the border, at some point, it's where folks are no longer pursued. Once they get to a certain point, it's like tag, and they go to base or something. They're left alone, and so you've got this kind of, at least in my opinion, you have this kind of dichotomy of things going on. One saying we need these people to work, and we want them here to work, and we will allow them to work, but they have to sneak across the border, and we'll spend billions of dollars to keep them from sneaking across. But if they get through the gauntlet, then it's all good. And I'm not, and I'll be honest, I'm not necessarily against the idea of illegal immigration. It just strikes, of folks coming here to work. So I'm not against it at all. It just strikes me as very odd to spend so much money on keeping people out, but there's no enforcement of the folks that are hiring them on the interior. So although there's many parts of the act, the recent Arizona Act, that I don't really care for, boy, I certainly understand it. In some ways I feel that way. It doesn't make any sense to spend that much money and time trying to keep people out, but if they get through your gauntlet, it's good.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you.
One of the things that we heard, and I don't know if this would be true so much for Cabeza, is there was a notion that getting the Border Patrol to stop the action closer to the border, as opposed to them moving up and having so much activity, within Oregon Pipe, deeper up north, that the idea that they'll be able to achieve their mission and therefore stop it within that, Roosevelt boundary. Is that kind of what you see as sort of their objective?
Or even a reasonable objective?
A reasonable objective. Is it?
I don't see it. I actually don't see it as a reasonable objective. And that for that to be a reasonable objective, they would need a lot more agents than they have right now. That's the one problem with this, is that that they are still. To complete their mission and to be effective, they still do not have enough people and enough resources. And so, with that said, I don't think that necessarily. With that said, you're talking about specifically within the Roosevelt easement. I don't think they can do that. I don't think there's enough time or enough reaction time for them to be able to shut it down in that area. Now, if you're talking about a mile or two from the border, and to basically focus most of their action within there, I think that they would be a lot more successful. Yes, and I would like to see. I would like to see more of their efforts be focused that close to the border.
Because that then reduces the impact to your natural resources.
That's exactly it.
Yeah. Okay.
Not only that, but I think it's more efficient for them as well, because then if you are deploying people along, 650-mile portion of border, and that deployment can be anywhere from right on the line to 30 miles north. That's a lot of land to cover, versus if you're basically narrowing it down to something a lot tighter.
You're talking about capacity of the Border Patrol and of the sort of security forces, and now the Park Service, I know, has a lot of people who are basically security people, not park rangers, which leads to the question about relative resources. While there may be more personnel, do you still have the same capacity in the conservation area? Even though there's a lot more people on the border, is the capacity and person power available that you need to do the conservation job that you need, or is some of that being diverted?
No, so much of it is being diverted towards the issue of the border. I mean, in terms of, we have we manage 3 times as much land as Oregon Pipe, but our staff is like 4 times smaller. Mm-hmm. Every action or proposal that comes in requires our staff to stop everything and to review that and to work on it, which takes away our ability to do the things that we would have traditionally done 10, 12 years ago.
I'm assuming that would also mean being proactive. You mentioned that before. You're just sort of in a reactive mode. And so sort of the longer-term visioning and the work that you would be doing, and even access is inhibited as well.
That's just it, yeah. So, and that's what the challenge is what we do now is we don't try and do everything. We try and do a few things extremely well. Uh-huh. And we try and stay on point with those things and not have to be and try and fit things into our planning level.
Does Cabeza
that's one of the things.
Does Cabeza have security detail as well as positions?
Well, we have 5 law enforcement officers.
Okay.
Could you just tell us a few of the things that you feel most positive about in your 10 years at Cabeza?
What do I feel the most positive about? I feel the most positive about the fact that in 2002 we had 19 to 21 pronghorn in the United States. We now have 70 or so out in the wild, and we have 70 in the captive rearing pen. And we just did a release of 20 pronghorn into the U.S. population this winter. We're looking at in the next year or so of starting the second population in other portions of southern Arizona. And the relationships and the partnerships that exist between federal, state, and local agencies in this area is absolutely superb. And the ability to be partners and to work on things is quite honestly amazing. And if you would have asked me in 2002 that we would be talking about establishing the second population in 2010, I would say that was absolutely impossible. And it goes all to the credit of all of these federal, state, and local groups that are willing to roll up their sleeves, work together to make something happen. And so, and I think that's one of the more positive things about this area is that there's a real can-do spirit, and that folks do work together and trying to meet broader landscape goals and objectives while still trying to complete local mission requirements.
Great, I'm glad I asked that question. This has really been very helpful to us. I hope it's not been taxing for you. I think, is there anything you might want to add that we didn't ask?
Well, I think I'm good.
Okay, well, so are we.
We really appreciate you taking the time, and I know you're very busy, so thank you very much. We'll be in touch. I've got your email. As I said, we're madly working on a draft now. Hope to get it out in the next month or so for folks to review it.
Okay.
Thanks very much.
All right, take care.
Bye.
Bye.